Welcome to Channel 24. Russia shows its true face again. Civilian deaths in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia ahead of Washington talks. On the eve of a crucial meeting in the White House, the Kremlin once more made clear its answer to calls for an unconditional ceasefire, more bloodshed. Russian forces struck Zaporizhia with 2 Iskander missiles, hitting a marketplace and critical infrastructure site. 3 people were killed and 20 injured, including a 17-year-old boy. An overnight drone strike on a residential block in Kharkiv killed at least 7 people, including 2 children, a 1-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy. 4 drones slammed into the 5-story building, tearing part of it down and setting multiple floors ablaze. Rescuers dug through rubble to reach survivors, while shocked residents fled in panic. At least 18 were injured, many suffering from acute shock. Just hours earlier, a Russian ballistic missile had already struck another district of Kharkiv, wounding 11. Overnight drones also targeted Ukrainians' southern Odessa region, igniting a fire at a fuel depot. The timing was not accidental, as President Volodymyr Zelensky heads into a high-stakes meeting with US President Donald Trump and European leaders. Moscow rejects even the notion of an unconditional ceasefire and answers instead with missiles and drones. Today is a pivotal moment for Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky arrives in Washington for talks with Donald Trump, joined by top European leaders, to decide whether this war moves closer to peace or deepens further. The key question on the table: should there be a ceasefire or a broader peace deal? What real security guarantees can the US and Europe provide to Ukraine? And what to do about Russia's demands on territory? European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen insists that Ukraine's sovereignty cannot be compromised, while sanctions against Moscow will only tighten. Zelensky stressed that the priority is to stop the killings and move quickly toward a final agreement, but not under the barrel of Russian guns. As media across the globe note, this is the day Ukraine faces a choice about its future, with allies watching closely and with the shadow of Putin's demands still looming over the talks. World leaders are deeply anxious as they gather in Washington ahead of President Volodymyr Zelensky meeting with Donald Trump at the White House. According to the New York Times report, European prime ministers and presidents rushed in to join Zelensky to prevent Ukraine from being forced into a one-sided deal and to keep the transatlantic alliance from fracturing. The reasons for this alarm, as outlined by the paper, are several. First, Trump abruptly reversed his stance on insisting on a ceasefire before negotiations, raising fears that Putin has swayed him. European officials worry that Trump may pressure Zelensky into concessions that would ultimately weaken or even dismantle Ukraine as a sovereign state. Second, there is an unease about the future of NATO. Putin's long-term goal has been to split the alliance, and Trump's recent rhetoric suggesting Ukraine must recognize Russia's greater power and put NATO membership on hold echoes the Kremlin's line. European leaders view this as a dangerous signal that Washington may be withdrawing from its traditional role as the security anchor of Europe. Third, there is the memory of Trump's earlier confrontation with Zelensky at the White House, when he publicly told the Ukrainian president he had no cards in this war. European diplomats fear a repeat of that dynamic, with Ukraine pushed into talks from a position of weakness. In short, the gathering of leaders in Washington reflects a mix of urgency and anxiety to shield Zelensky from undue pressure, to hold Trump to Western commitments, and to prevent Putin from exploiting divisions between the US and its allies. The Wall Street Journal writes that Washington may provide Ukraine with the security guarantees as a part of a possible peace deal with Russia. This would not mean American boost on the ground, but rather support measures to back European allies who have said they could deploy their own troops to Western Ukraine if an agreement is reached. So what kind of guarantees are being discussed? According to the newspaper, they could include US fighter jets on standby outside Ukraine, supplying European forces with American-made air defense system, flying US drones over Ukraine from abroad, sharing military intelligence, and transporting European soldiers and equipment on American aircraft. Britain and France have already expressed readiness to send limited contingents, but only under the condition that the United States acts as a backstop to protect their forces. Analysts in Kyiv stress that Putin's goal is not simply territory but all of Ukraine, which is why President Zelensky insists on strong American guarantees before even considering a deal. Former US Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor says Zelensky should welcome Trump's willingness to support such assurance, but at the same time make it clear that Ukraine will keep fighting regardless. Meanwhile, CNN reports that Trump may try to push Kyiv toward Putin's version of peace, while European leaders remain skeptical of Russia's promises and worry about whether Trump would even uphold NATO's collective defense if Moscow struck near its borders. The Politico article Slovakia cashes in on weapons to Ukraine while Prime Minister Fico befriends Putin, highlights the double game played by Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico. On the one hand, he has suspended official military aid to Ukraine, criticized EU sanctions against Russia, rejected NATO membership for Kyiv, and met with Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, Slovakia's private arms industry is booming, sending weapons to the front and profiting from the war. Slovakia's arms exports reached 115 billion euros in 2024, equal to about 1% of the national economy. This is double the figure from 2023 and 10 times higher than before Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Slovak companies are producing 155mm ammunition, Susanne 2 self-propelled howitzers, detection system, and electronic warfare technology. The government openly admits it will not restrict private firms, framing the arms trade as an economic necessity. Defense Minister Robert Kalinak said at the opening of a new ammunition plant that this was not support for war but support for trade. Officials argue that arms production creates jobs and stimulates growth, and most equipment is exported first to the West before reaching Ukraine. Fico, meanwhile, continues to present himself as a pacifist. He insists that not a single bullet will be sent from state warehouses to Ukraine and uses populist rhetoric about protecting pensions instead of buying tanks. Yet his government also seeks EU funds, including from the new €150 billion Security Action for Europe program. Critics in Slovakia and the European Parliament calls this a communication strategy built on pacifist posturing and opportunism, officially withholding state weapons while allowing private companies to profit from export. This dual approach demonstrates how Slovakia balances between political messaging and economic pragmatism. That's all for now. See you next time.